reading this week just about the date, one of the things that kept coming up in the different articles and things I read was how within being a day of celebration, and mentioned what you talked about of looking back to look forward, that it's a day to celebrate education and development, and to how do we continue to better ourselves as we move forward. And so it made me even think, like, I pastor a predominantly white church. It's not, completely, but predominantly. And I think that theme of education and learning is as important for us as anyone else celebrating this. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be able to have you share about why this day is important. And are there any suggestions you would give to the church as far as, man, if you want to learn more or educate yourselves or be more mindful of the reality of this, what would you suggest?
Definitely educate yourselves. I think Netflix and Amazon Prime both have sections of movies right now that are on, about Black life in America. I mean, it could be as simple as watching certain movies, understand history. One of the things is that I've heard people say before, why do we keep talking about slavery? Can't we just move on? It's interesting that people want to move on from slavery, but when it comes to things like 9/11, the Holocaust, even Pearl Harbor, we say never forget. And so I think that we have to make sure that just because something is uncomfortable for you doesn't mean to ignore it or try to just skirt past it. I believe that if this nation is to ever heal and become whole, we have to have a reckoning and move to this place where we acknowledge the history, because what has happened is, the history books, just like you never heard of Juneteenth, and you're a well-educated man, right? But you've never heard of Juneteenth. So I think one of the things is we have to be intentional to educate our children about the history of this nation, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think there is a way in which we romanticize the history of this nation. The fact is the founding fathers were slaveholders, and we can't ignore that fact. So I think that, and let's not make excuses for that. Let's not pacify that. Let's not try to romanticize it. Let's not try to dress it up. It is what it is, because the fact of the matter is, until we come to grips with where we've been, we cannot fully embrace where we're going, which is this place of equity, which is this place where there is to be authentic collaboration, because authentic collaboration doesn't mean, I just put up a hashtag. And the other thing I've seen recently is that, people kind of doing this extrapolation where the statement Black Lives Matter and the organization Black Lives Matter are kind of put in the same, they're made to be synonymous. You don't have to agree with the platform of the Black Lives Matter organization, their political platform. So you don't have to agree with their platform. Saying that Black Lives Matter as a statement is not saying that only Black Lives Matter, because people often respond, well, all lives matter. And we're not saying that all lives matter, but the fact of the matter is, if you and I lived on the same block, and if your house was on fire and the fire department came to put out the fire in your house, and I stood outside and blocked the fire truck from getting to your house and told them, well, my house is important too. Well, it's not saying that my house is not important, but right now your house is the one that's on fire. Right. And so that Black Lives Matter is an affirmation that Black Lives Matter too, because throughout much of the history of this nation, Black lives were, and I'm not just talking about, because one of the things that happens, particularly in the church, let me just speak to the history of the church in this nation. Jamar Tisby has a great book out that I've been reading called The Cut of Compromise, that kind of details and delineates the history of how the church in America has been complicit in racism. Also, so if people are looking to be educated about this, I would recommend going on YouTube and listening to Tom Skinner's 1970 Urbana speech. Tom Skinner was a phenomenal leader and preacher and teacher. He spoke to so many of y'all are familiar with the Urbana Conference that happens every 3 years, one of the biggest missions conferences in the country. And he addressed that audience. Tom Skinner was a Black preacher, and he addressed that audience in 1970 and talked about the history of race in America from 1619 to that present day.
Wow.
And he talked about it also from a spiritual lens of how the Bible says in Ephesians 6 that we wrestle and to kind of entrench some of the evils that we've seen in our world. So yeah, definitely educating yourself, definitely, doing some research, but also saying, I'm not going to shield myself anymore from the truth about the history of this nation. But going back to what I said, saying Black Lives Matter doesn't say that other lives don't. It's saying that Black Lives Matter too, because for nearly 500 years, there has been a question mark as to whether Black Lives Matter. And for 400 of those 500 years, it was legally declared that Black lives did not matter and Black lives were in fact not human. It's really only in the last 50 years. So you talk about the history. Let's look at the trajectory of this nation from 1619 to now. 1619 is important because it was the marker of the first slaves being brought to Jamestown in Virginia. 20 and some odd slaves were brought to American shores in 1619. So last year we commemorated the 500-year anniversary of that. So you look at that history to now. So that's 500 years. And with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, those were deemed as the kind of legal and legislative determinants that Black lives do matter and that Black people in America should have equal rights. And so people are talking about this stuff is such a long time ago, it's all in the past. Well, 50 years is not a long time ago. I mean, there are people who are alive and well right now who lived through segregation.
Yeah.
My own parents lived through Jim Crow and lived through segregation. I know people who are just in their 60s who had to attend segregated schools. So it's really not that long ago when you think about the broader scheme of things. So for 500 on a 500-year span, that means 90% of the history of Black people in America has been this time of legalized segregation, racism, and oppression. And so it's the last 10%. So 90% is a big amount, right?
Yeah.
And so, like I said, it's really only in the last 50 years that there have been actual laws, legislation, and policies that have actually enforced the rights of African Americans in this country, legislatively and legally. So, again, educate yourself. And the other thing that I would say to folks is that I want to understand and learn. If you have a Black friend, a Black coworker, a Black colleague, understand that it can be draining and tiring as an African American to talk about things all the time. So if they don't want to talk about it at a time, don't take it personal. Don't feel as though they're angry at you as a person. Understand that the Bible says, "Be angry and sin not." There are ways in which we can be angry, but that doesn't mean we hate you. It doesn't mean that we want to do something evil to you. It just means that there are years of frustration. I carried the weight and could not use, public accommodations. My own parents lived through Jim Crow. My parents were born during the Depression. And so, I've heard my own parents talk about having, my dad, he raised us in Chicago. So, but even when he would drive back to the South, having to sleep in the car when they were on the road because they couldn't stay in a hotel because certain hotels do not allow Black people. So, you do a 12-hour drive from Chicago to Georgia, and, if you need to stop, there's no accommodation. So I carry the weight of having heard this stuff firsthand. I'm not talking about something I read in a history book. I'm talking about people who I know, my own flesh and blood, my family has actually lived through. And then, we deal with microaggressions today, right? Things like racial profiling, which is real. I'm a college-educated Black man, and I've been profiled. To this day, I still deal with getting on an elevator. elevator and people moving to the other side of the street in a suit and had people clutching purses or locking car doors. So, you know, we still do these kind of things today, what we call the microaggressions. So I would say to those who are listening, educate yourself, you know, and understand that when Black people talk about racism, it's not belly aching. It's not playing a victim card. I don't see myself as a victim. I see myself as a proud Black man, a proud follower of Jesus. I'm proud of where I've come from. I'm proud of the family lineage that I've come through, because it is a legacy of adversity, of overcoming adversity. It is a legacy of tenacity and perseverance. It's a legacy of strength, but it's also a legacy of faith. You know, one of the things that my parents, both my mother and my father, and my grandparents instilled in us is our faith in God, that, you know, Jesus is the way, that we've got to, you know, I learned prayer at an early age, but also you got to work for everything that you get. And as well, that nothing will be handed to you. Nothing is going to come easily. And those are values that were instilled in me. So I would just say to those who are listening, if you have Black friends, be sensitive to how they may feel right now. If they don't feel like talking, respect that, because, you know, you never know how people are processing things emotionally. And some people may say, well, they didn't even know George Floyd, or they didn't know these people. The fact is, you don't have to know someone to empathize with someone. The fact is, I could have been Ahmaud Arbery, the young man who was killed jogging in Brunswick, Georgia. You know, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, was killed. She's an EMT. She's a paramedic who was killed while sleeping in her home. So, you know, there's a lot of ways in which, for many African Americans, these things are traumatic. And then we're constantly seeing images in the media and on the news of murder and of killings and things that are happening. And then when you realize it could have been you, that's a traumatic thing.
Absolutely. Well, so much, Quentin. And one thing you said, I mean, so much, everything you said was brilliant, but the one thing I've never heard the correlation, and it is such a powerful image, that when it comes to Pearl Harbor and when it comes to 9/11, we say never forget. When things have been done to us, we don't want to forget that. But when our country has done something, man, it is a never forget part of our history. Yeah. And what a powerful way to put it. I appreciate that so much. And I've heard a couple of people say the same thing, just as far as when you try to talk to friends, coworkers, family members that are African American, if you get the cold shoulder, if they don't want to talk right now, to understand why. And I've even, you know, mentioned that to others. And so in that, I know you didn't have to do this. And I just want to just thank you so much. I appreciate so much you pouring into our church and others who might hear this in this way, of being such a man of God, that you want to encourage others during this time, and even as you process yourself personally. And so I just thank you so much for pouring into people in this way.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And, you know, I believe that the church has a responsibility. The church of every color, every stripe. You know, I referenced Revelation 7:9 earlier. Every tribe, every tongue, every people group, every nation under heaven, you know, around the throne of God in heaven. And I believe that's the heart of God. But we can't get there until we work down here. Jesus, you know, taught the disciples to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And we have a responsibility to work to make earth look like heaven. So
yes, absolutely. Well, hopefully together, our churches, we can help. If we might not hit the whole world, but we're going to work on Chicago as hard as we can, right?
We definitely will. We definitely will.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Quentin. I really appreciate your time.
Not a problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you.